Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm gonna do something a little bit different. I had a piece on the easel that I probably had 9 hours of footage for already, and the fact is it just wasn't working. And I was getting really frustrated working on it. It's close to being done, I think, but I just wasn't really okay waiting around to find out when it would be finished. And not only that, I just didn't think it was worth it to get that frustrated. So I'm changing things up today. I'm starting a totally new piece, one that's really designed to be completed in one sitting. And I thought I would just go ahead and walk you through the process of making this. This video is going to be a little bit different for those of you who've watched me for a while. You might have picked up that I typically paint the painting and and then record a voiceover after the fact. And I don't want to do that today. I want to talk to you as I actually paint. So this video is going to be a little unique. My voiceover is probably not going to be as goal-directed, I suppose. This is going to be a lot more like a stream of consciousness, and I hope you enjoy. I hope this gives you a fresh perspective, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. So one thing on the previous piece I was working on that just wasn't working for me is that I was getting way too stiff, way too tight, way too photorealistic. And that was the main thing that I really wanted to break out of here. And so the first step that I took was that I went ahead and chose a reference for this piece that I knew would help me to avoid this trap. It was a reference where I looked at it and pretty immediately could say, like, yes, I know how to paint this successfully using the style that I really want to paint in. And that makes a really big difference. And sometimes we can think that, you know, we've got that under control when the reality is that we don't. I think that's what I ran into with the previous piece. So it's not by any means foolproof, but it's worth thinking about that regularly. Now, one thing I am being really particular about here as I work on this is I want to be really intentional with my drawing. I want it to be loose, I want it to be expressive, but I don't want to have to go and correct a lot of mistakes either. And so while the beginning of this might look pretty loose and gestural and maybe haphazard as a result, the reality is that I'm being pretty darn meticulous here. I'm trying a newer approach, a newer way of thinking about the drawing, which is that I really just want to feel like I'm evoking the subject without getting too specific, too literal. Now, this does have pretty specific color, so I'm actually going to, with my reference in Photoshop, I'm going to actually use the eyedropper tool to just check and see what colors I'm seeing in this reference. Right, I nearly fell into the trap there of putting in midtones before I really established the darks, so I'm gonna go ahead and fix that. One thing that I think I could probably benefit from here is being a little bit more patient and intentional or methodical in a lot of my paint mixtures, and basically the order in which I'm progressing through the creation of this piece. So right now I'm really wanting to start to rush into a lot of the flesh tones so that I can establish some of the color harmonies, but I know that this is going to create a situation where I'm rushing. and I really establish important things out of order. So I might experiment with this a little bit, but I'm going to acknowledge that this could really create a problem for me, and I can always back off a little bit if I realize that this just isn't the move. I want to go ahead and key in some of the blonde in her hair, and blonde is always such a tricky color because we like to think of it as yellow, and typically there are a lot more browns, a lot more greens, and a lot less yellow than we actually are inclined to think is in there. So with blonde hair especially, I really try and check it aggressively often in terms of just checking my color mixtures. You know, using a color picker or color checker can be really useful for this. Using an eyedropper tool if you're working off of a photo reference can be useful. Now, I've talked a little bit in recent videos about wanting to really combine the looseness that I see in my inspiration board. I'll go ahead and link back to the video where I discuss this in case you haven't checked out that video. But there's a couple of different ways that the artists that I admire really go about achieving this kind of looseness. There's some artists who do it with a very wet into wet approach, and other artists who really focus on dry brush techniques, especially in earlier stages of the painting. And here I am really trying to combine these two. So I don't necessarily have like a wet and dry technique, but rather I'm combining the nature of some of the drier brushwork in terms of the direction of the strokes and the focus on calligraphy. And I'm really trying to combine that with the wet texture from the other approach. And now I actually quite like just how wet that is. And so I'm gonna do something a little bit controversial, and I'm gonna go ahead and establish an overall base flesh tone. I might regret this choice, but you know what? This is all a prima, so if I get it wrong, I can erase. Now the brush that I have is a little bit small for this task, so I might need to swap this out, but we're just gonna see first. Now this is a little bit too wet. I know, because I'm starting to see some of the canvas texture show through, and it's trying to trip down the page on me. So I need to dry out my brush a little bit and probably remix this mixture to try and remove some of the Gamsol that I have in here. And I can also remember that because the canvas is now wet, I can actually mix this up a little bit drier, and those two paint layers will interact and get me about the paint consistency that I'm looking for. And I'm just constantly checking that paint texture as I go, making sure that the second that I see that I'm making some kind of mistake, that I actually take the action necessary to fix it, rather than simply continuing on knowing that something is wrong. And I think this is something that we take for granted that like really separates the pro from the amateur, is that the pro has the experience necessary and is also intentional enough to really actively interrogate the process and ask, what is it that is actually going wrong here? Is my value off? Is there something wrong with the paint texture? And they will go ahead and like get very clear on what that issue is and fix it, rather than continuing to put things down when there is clearly something wrong. Now already I'm starting to get the feel of the color harmony. And for me, the most natural way to do this is to just go ahead and establish a big average base tone. Other artists will work differently. There's not really a right or wrong answer. There's simply what is most accessible to you at the moment, and then what is most conducive to creating the kind of work that you're interested in. And I'm really trying to juggle both of those things. There's a chance that the kind of work I really want to create would call on me to block this in using a different method. But I also need to just be mindful and respectful of what makes sense to me in my brain, and what really helps me to make an image using the tools and knowledge that I have right now. So there, I'm a little watery on the paint texture. I don't think it's going to be an issue, but I definitely want to be careful before I potentially exacerbate that. Now, as far as preserving fat over lean, which is to say, I want to make sure that my paint film is going to be stable. It's going to stand the test of time. What I'm thinking about to help accomplish this is simply I'm prioritizing using something like Gamsol in the early layers as my medium. And then as I move to subsequent layers, I'm going to switch to Oleogel or Gamblin solvent-free gel medium. I use these two interchangeably. All right, so with that, I have my overall color key in here. So I can start to play a little bit. I can begin diving into a little bit more of the drawing and actually bringing this piece to life a bit more. And this is typically about the stage where I might consider doing that swap from Gamsol to my gel medium. Once I have a base layer of paint that I'm working into. Now, this comber brush that I have here is a really interesting tool. It has these kind of jagged bristles. This is why we call it a comber, because the ends of the brush itself look like they form a comb. This is a tricky brush to use primarily because it's so soft. That's actually why I just switched that brush out to go ahead and choose the one that I am using presently. A lot of artists that I'm really inspired by use the comber or used the comber or a brush similar to it. Richard Schmid, Daniel Keyes, but they certainly are not the only ones. And so it's a brush that I often will have students pick up and experiment with. And it's also a brush that can yield some pretty intense frustration. And I think the cause of this is honestly because they expect the comber to make a mark that's much closer to this very smooth synthetic Creative Mark Qualita filbert that I have here. One thing that I find really useful is if you're going to use something like a comber, be really intentional about when you are using it. Use it for a master copy where you have reason to believe that the artist you're studying used a comber or something really similar to it. But this brush often involves using a very, very light touch, and you need paint that is sufficiently thinned, and you need a sufficient amount of paint on the brush. If there's too much drag because there's not enough paint or because the paint is too stiff, you're gonna feel like you are fighting that comber the whole time. What's really interesting about this model and this reference is just how much backlit she is and how much light there is like catching her hair and really creating a glow. It's a little bit tricky to see at this stage in this painting simply because the background is so light. So I'm going to go ahead and take some steps to establish more of that value relationship between the subject and the background. And while I do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about creating glow, especially in something like blonde hair. Now, while I am establishing some of these background colors and values, I'm also thinking quite a bit about background shapes and specifically the ways in which we can use negative shape to define our subject. And what I mean by that is I want to basically check to make sure that the face is the right shape. And I can use these background marks to start to refine that. So my first priority here right now is simply to go ahead and get the level of opacity and get the color that I'm really looking for out of this. And then I want to start to be a little bit more intentional with some of the shapes that I make into the blank part of the canvas. And then from there, I'm gonna go back and carve back into the face some. That's a nice mark. I really like the opacity and the translucency that we get from that mark. Okay, now I'm starting to get a little bit of interesting variety in some of these shapes. This is one of the challenges of working alla prima, is that you really have to be juggling so many different questions and issues simultaneously. So not only am I thinking about the drawing and the color and the value, but I'm also really trying to make sure that the marks that I'm putting down are beautiful, that they are worth looking at. One issue I can see I'm running into here is that I have not established the shape of this jawline correctly. So as soon as I see a problem like that and I understand what the solution is, I want to go ahead and make that correction. I don't want to just leave errors that I know how to solve, because that will inevitably lead to other errors. One error, though, that I can see pretty plainly is that I've moved the nose way too far down the face. It's one of those things where when the model is at a particular angle, we are often biased toward kind of straightening the model's face back out. So as soon as I've realized I've made an error like that, I want to go ahead and set it right. I'm gonna have to keep working over and over to make sure this nose is staying high enough because I keep just trying to correct it down too much. One thing I really do enjoy about working wet into wet though is just how much I feel like I can push and pull the paint around and just play. And I think this is probably an important aspect of me understanding what it is that I really want to be doing. It also can be really useful, for example, if I understand that I really want to be combining gestural brush marks with a wet on wet approach. In addition to some of the artists who are on my inspiration board, I might want to look at painters such as Lim. So now again with this comber, now that I've picked it back up, I find that I really do have to add quite a bit of medium to make it behave as intended, or I need to have some solvent in there just because it gives me a little bit more slip, a little bit more easily than the medium will give me. So right now, as I look at this, I actually feel like I quite like this as a color study. And I like how high key this is. And one kind of trick to keeping it this high key is really what I've done with the eyes. I've picked something that I knew would harmonize with the rest of the composition, but just stay a little bit lighter in value and a little bit more chromatic, which is this purple. think I'm actually going to go ahead and leave this here as a color study for right now. I might dive back into this piece a little bit in the future, but for now, I would say this served a really useful purpose. It enabled me to reset, which was really, really helpful. I think in general, we try and push through on paintings far too often. And now, if I really do want to go back into the piece I was working on before, I think this will just give me a little bit of useful muscle memory and kind of guidance on how I really want to go about exploring that particular painting. So I'm not going to go ahead and like overthink this any further. I hope this was helpful, and if you do have questions about, how I went about approaching this piece or how you can apply something like this to your own work, please do go ahead and let me know in the comments, and on my next video I'll go ahead and speak to those. If watching me work through this is helpful to you in any way, either the conversation about resets, seeing how I do a color study of a portrait, or just talking about how to go about getting looseness after you've just embarked in a painting that really encouraged you to be too tight, I have more information in the description below about how to reach out to work with me. I have more details on the mentorship itself, an application to see if we are a fit to work together, and just more details so that you can find out more and determine whether or not this is something you would be interested in. I love helping artists to reach their really big goals. I also really specialize in helping artists to figure out how to optimize your painting practices, much in the same way I'm doing here, where I took a painting where I was just getting overly tight and was feeling really just overwhelmed, like this wasn't working, and was able to go ahead and reset and get myself back into a useful place. If that's the kind of support and mentorship you are interested in, I would love to hear from you, so make sure you check out those links in the description.